Hi, this is Cliff Berg, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko, joining you once again. With me, I have special guests, the regular, I guess we can call him by now, Mike Cadell. Mike, greetings.
Greetings. Howdy, y'all.
Glad to have you. We have Janelle Lanza joining us once again. Man, she came back for a show after being on a show with Gifford. God bless her. God bless her. Janelle, greetings.
Hello. Great to be back.
We are glad to have you. And our first time guest, Nicholas Carey. Did I say it right?
Sorry, but yeah, good. Close enough.
Close enough. Nicholas is joining us from Finland. So we are doing a rare daytime recording and no beer involved, which is kind of odd. But, you know, I have the day off, so I can start drinking. All the rest of everybody, it wouldn't really be fair. So what are we talking about this episode? Well, a bunch of us just finished reading the book. I'm going to have to edit this in post. We finished reading the book by Matthew Skelton and Manuel. I'm going to say it's Pais, Team Topologies. So this book has been floating on the Agile ecosystem for a while. People like Mike Burrows have mentioned it. Safe actually is starting to mention it. And serendipitously, a whole slew of us started reading it at the same time. So now what we're going to do is rarely do we ever sit down and talk about a book without the author on. We purposely wanted to try and have a panel discussion. And then I'm going to reach out to Matt and have him come on later so we can actually pick his brain in like a part 2 of this. But to start, and I'm going to start with you, Janelle. What did you see? What did you hear about this book that got you interested? That had you actually, out of all the Agile books that are available on Amazon, to pick it up and dive in? What led you down that path?
Who's starting?
Starting you. I'm starting with you, Janelle.
Great. Well, there was, to be honest, the first motivator. Whenever I see a group working on a book, I think, "Ooh, why is this important to me? Like, I'm a very competitive person in that regard. And so I have to just check myself on that and say, just because Mike's doing it doesn't mean I need to do it." The final straw was when I was in final job interview preparations and the hiring manager was talking about the nature of the work in Team Topologies. So I was like, all right, I'm going to read it. The parts that, and I was exposed to it in Scaled Agile, but the parts that really resonated to me we're really digging into the communication between teams. I was really surprised to see how much of that, the different, are we collaborating? Are we communicating? Are we making something together? So that's the part that really stuck out at me as I want to make those connections in my practice so that I can raise my game.
Perfect. How about you, Nicholas? What led you down the path to end up with Team Topologies?
Well, it was like you said, it popped out like in many places on Twitter and like in different meetups, etc. And I think like for some time I was actually not reading it because I think the title is maybe a little bit boring, like Team Topologies. What is that? Although the kind of subtitle, organizing business and technology for teams for fast flow is much better. But then eventually, like I just decided I need to order it. It's been popping up too many times, and it just happened to be at the same time that everyone else apparently started reading it. So good timing in that sense.
Serendipitous timing for all of us. Amazon must have noticed this real quick spike and said somebody must be running an ad campaign somewhere. How about you, Mike?
Well, the momentum started growing on the Discord channel for it. So kind of along the lines of Janelle, I looked at it and, to be honest, a little bit of FOMO kicked in, and I went out to Amazon. I was just kind of looking at some of the reviews and saw a review by a well-known figure in the Agile world that pretty much said this book is trash. So when I saw that juxtaposed with the positive vibe that it's received throughout the rest of the community, that really piqued my interest. I thought, I got to see what's going on here.
It is kind of funny. That's the way our human brains work, right? Like half the people say, I love this movie. Half the people say, I hate this movie. It kind of does make you want to see the movie so you can form your own opinion and figure out who's right and who's wrong.
Sure.
So for the benefit of the audience, I'm just going to real quickly blaze through some of the main points of the book before we start digging into the details. So the three foundational assumptions is an organization is an ecosystem shaped by the interactions of both individuals and teams. And teams are not just a collection of individuals. They're something that behaves differently. And the backstop of this book, which is what I really thought fascinating, is the idea of Conway's law, which is systems that we design will typically resemble the communication lines and hierarchy inside of an organization. So Conway's law, if you think about it, is a strong driver of software product shape, and organizations benefit from addressing the implications of this law. As a shout out to the Comic Agile guys, they actually did a comic where they reference this without referencing this, where it's some guy sitting there in an office ruminating in his brain, where he talks about how HR decides the structure of the organization, and then the structure of the organization with Conway's law decides the software we build. And he has this light bulb moment where he said, HR designs our software. And that was one of those things where you kind of laugh, but you're kind of like, I'm laughing because if I take two steps back and think about it, that's actually probably not too far off considering Conway's law. So the book 10 ties back into how do we organize and interact with our teams, especially when you get to organizations at scale, at size, multiple teams, multiple complexity, all talking to each other. They come up with an idea of 4 different team topologies, which is streamlined, platform, enabling, and complicated subsystem. They have all these interaction patterns. And one of the things the first point that I really want to dive in with the three of you is the idea of organizing around cognitive load. For me, that was one of the parts in the book where my brain just kind of exploded because I was thinking about, well, holy crap, this makes total sense. Nicholas, what did you think of that point? The point around the different types of cognitive load a team will experience, and that you should divide your teams to make sure that their cognitive load is truly spent on the heuristic work that they have to do, not how do I maintain this platform? How do I do this process? What were your thoughts?
I think that was one of the most insightful parts of the book for me. I have never read about cognitive load theory before. So very briefly, kind of the definition is that you have a certain amount of working memory, a certain amount of things you can keep in your working memory. And if you exceed that limit, then you kind of get into this cognitive overload. So you need to manage that. That was the key insight there. And they talked about that there are 3 types of cognitive loads you have. So you have this intrinsic cognitive load. So if you think about learning something let's say riding a bike, if you have never done that before, it's difficult for you. But then you can reduce that intrinsic cognitive load by for instance hiring people that are know that those things ready, or you can buy a bike or select a technology that is easy. And then you have this extraneous cognitive load, so meaning that you that's the environment. So using this bike example, how easy it is to ride that bike in a certain environment, and you want to eliminate that. So you want to have kind of a technologies, for instance, that or make it as easy to for instance, deploy the technologies. So that's the thing in the environment. And then you have this the last part, which is the what they call the germline cognitive load. So that's where it comes from, the theory, and that's where you do the kind of creative thinking and learning, and you want to have teams as much kind of focus on that type of load. So I think that was very insightful, and how you can kind of reduce those other type of loads, and that informed then how do you form these kind of type of teams and how they are structured. So I thought that was very interesting theory behind
So,
yeah.
Well, thanks, Nicholas, because you did a better job explaining it than I really could have. And it looks like, based upon the video, you did that off the top of your head. So God bless you. God bless you. Janelle, I want to ask you. You said early as we started this episode that you came across this book as part of a hiring process where the organization you were joining is using this as kind of a bellwether, right, to do sizing. What were your thoughts on that whole cognitive load piece when you got to that? And could you automatically picture how a company would maybe slice and dice their teams? Where was your brain going when you hit that part?
My first place it went was empathy. Say, oh, that's a nice way to share some of the messes we see, unintentional messes. A lot of organizations think they're trying to do the right thing and trying to be strategic or whatever, but it ends up with this load where we can't get anything done. So that was my first thought on this. What I'm trying to do with, I'm not going to tell you about, here's what I'm doing at Globant and tell you something, but what I'm trying to do as a consultant and coach that's trying to have that big view and advisory view is trying to draw flow into that. Because some of these constructs, like even when we were talking about HR just a moment ago, might feel out of reach, even in those, pie in the sky conversations where we're trying to just say, let's suspend the disbelief for just a moment and talk about possibility here. So even within that, I think some of the stuff can feel out of reach. And so I love how flow is brought into this, because I think that's something we can help people grab onto.
Perfect. Mike, thoughts on the whole cognitive load aspect?
Echo what Janelle just mentioned about how bringing flow into the conversation is helpful. For me, that was the thing that really kind of lit up the aha moment about the thing with cognitive load is, as I was reading this, I was thinking back over, a somewhat lengthy career in software development and just relating to different contexts I've worked in, and could see where when the cognitive load was high, the flow was low, and people were not happy, and it was almost a toxic environment. So that it was kind of neat because there's now words to describe what I've experienced and kind of learned and evolved over the years, and it's interesting using that term and putting the decisions about how cognitive load is affecting things, naming it and calling it out loud. Some people just kind of recoil and like, what's this airy fairy stuff you're talking about? And other people kind of get it. But there was one other point there that really hit home for me in the context of the client that I'm currently working with. They're building a new platform, new product that is pretty much API based. So speaking with the CTO recently, I was able to bring to him the idea that a selling point of your new product is that it's designed and built in such a way that the cognitive load on your client, your customers who are going to integrate this into their ecosystem, that cognitive load is going to be lower. So that gives you a competitive advantage, which translates into your stuff can be integrated faster, cheaper, more reliably. So there's a business case for it as well.
For me, I think the thing that jumped out was I could never remember how to do anything in Jira. I can never remember how to do anything in Jira. And I'll get all these emails that say, hey, in Jira, to do this, you got to do this. And it's like a 10-step process. And I usually just blank it out. And I had somebody say to me, Jay, you always ask me to send this email like 5 times. And at first I'm like, man, am I really that lazy and dumb? But then I thought about it, and it ties to that first type of cognitive load, the intrinsic cognitive load. How do you work in the space? And with a limited load inside of our brains, I really don't care. I said to him flat out, I realized I really don't care to remember, because I know if I have a question, I'm going to email you and you're going to send me back the same email you've sent me 10 times. But I don't need to remember that because I can offload that to something else. And this ties to the cognitive load thing. We can do a whole episode on that. This ties to how dumb GPS has made us. I actually went up to where I grew up the other weekend. I spent 20 years living there, and I drove around town and then went to visit a friend. And my dad said, oh, how did you get from here to here? Did you take this road? Did you take this road? And I went, Dad, I don't know.
I don't
know.
know.
What do you mean you don't know? You lived there for 20 years. You don't know. I'm like, but I kind of just followed the GPS. It's like, Jason, you don't know the streets you're on? I said, Dad, I can close my eyes and I can picture them. Don't ask me to tell you what streets they are, because I've offloaded that. It's like human calculator, right? None of us can do math in our heads anymore because all those teachers that told us we'd never have a calculator, liars. All right. So there's another topic in here that I really want to talk about. The idea of code ownership. And I know this is a hot button topic. In the book, it talks about how code ownership is owned by a team. We talk about collective code ownership in Agile. We talk about good code ownership standards in XP. And yet this is kind of a hot button because it basically says Mike owns his code, Janelle owns hers, Nicholas owns his. And there was an open question when we built this agenda where we wanted to discuss, does this create silos and inhibit collaboration? Or is this just a good practice we should really think about? And Nicholas, I'm going to start with you. What do you think? Where can you see some of the benefits to doing this, to organizing your team around a particular code base, but where are some of the drawbacks?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I think, one of the like surprising recommendations they had. I've always been like used to thinking that you should go like with shared ownership. It's better for flow and all that. And these guys said that no, do the opposite. And kind of like the reasoning they had was that they want to have like someone like owning, like being like the steward of the quality of the system. And actually it's not like that black and white. Like they while they recommend a strong ownership of the code, they still said that other teams could like should be able to see that code, and they should be able to provide their pull requests. But it's important someone like looks like through through that pull request and see that does it make sense, or is it some kind of like local optimization for that team that doesn't like benefit the whole system. So that was the thinking there, and I think that makes sense, although I'm not sure like how absolute this rule should be.
True. Janelle, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm with Nicholas on that. I think there's opportunity there. I think it takes situational context. What I also think is just like with other topics of ownership, you can't just tell someone, you can't just tell a group of people and say, okay, you need to own your own code now. And so I think, if the theory or the practice works at an org, like if you think this will work at your organization, having the communication around that and the support to make that happen is super important. So it's not just we read the book and we know what this is. You need to go read that book and own your own code. So I think it's more of the how that
right. It's not necessarily the theory, it's how you actually talk yourself through it.
Yes.
Right. So Mike, I'm going to ask you same question, but I'm going to put it under a different lens, germane to a conversation you and I were having outside of work. How is the idea of collective code ownership impacted by the tragedy of the commons? Do you think this helps solve for the tragedy of the commons, or is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you think?
I feel like along similar lines to what Nicholas and Janelle have been saying, that with appropriate expectations and guardrails or guidance, not guardrails, guidance. The idea of, I'd use the term stewardship as opposed to ownership, because if you have anybody just piling in, you have chaos and quality degrades quickly, which is kind of the point of that's made in the book. But then there's a counterpoint to that in that by along the lines of the tragedy of the commons, if you don't have some diversity of thought and practice coming into that code base, it can get kind of stale or insular, or it can start to degrade in its own right. So the sweet spot is figuring out with the human beings that are interacting with that code in that organization, and the ecosystem they're in, and the motivations they have, and the time pressures they have, and the skills they have, what's the right blend. And there's no simple answer, but there's a possible anti-pattern that I want to be real alert to, and that is ownership becoming exclusive and inhibiting flow, which is the point that the book makes. The flip side to that is, I think of it more as code stewardship. So I steward and look after this bit of code, and I welcome and bring others to contribute to it. But if it goes too far and gets into the tragedy of the commons kind of situation, then you're inhibiting flow because you're spending so much time fixing pull requests or whatever mechanism you use, or quality, takes a hit and it affects everybody. So there's a real art as much as a science to it.
I like that choice of the word stewardship as opposed to ownership, because stewardship is it still implies ownership, but not so tightly coupled. It implies, hey, I'm just like I'm the basically what's it called? It's a guy who works at the zoo. I'm the one who basically controls everything, and I pass it along to another. I'm just a zookeeper, a groundskeeper at this point, right? I don't own it. I'm just helping to take care and make sure that it thrives and that it continues existence. I really like that idea. So I'm going to bounce to you, Nicholas, and for the benefit of our audience, I'd like to talk about the inverse Conway. So can you, for those who may not be familiar, can you explain what the inverse Conway is?
Yeah, so I have to start with explaining what Conway's law is then. So basically, was the first name Ed Conway, or well, whatever. But this guy in the 60s, he was like studying the first like software systems and found out that those systems kind of mirror the communication patterns you have between people designing them. The idea in the inverse Conway law is that you identify what is like the intended architecture you want to have for your big system, and then like you design the organization to follow those lines so that they don't have to kind of like fight the architecture that you have. So that's how I would put it.
Perfect. So Janelle, does this work in real life? What do you think? If you were just speculating, if we're just philosophers sitting around the Oracle at Delphi, right? We have big agile A's on our foreheads. Where can you see this running into problems?
My forehead's kind of small for the A. I'm joking. Real problems. So I think again, that's like a massive change for some of these very established organizations. And there has to be, like, what's the hypothesis for changing for us at this company? So I think there's a lot of rigor behind that a lot of places are in a big hurry. And I'm not saying this in a like negative way, it's just the way it is. And so how can you convince, perhaps, using creating a hypothesis? So if an organization said, we think if we do this, this is going to happen and these other benefits will happen. How can they do an experiment with that? You're talking about teams of humans. And so I would say, I think if there's a way to do some kind of smaller scaled experiment with this, that again, it doesn't have to do with agile or safe or Kanban. It's about, we have these business outcomes that we're not able to get. We have flow problems or whatever it is. And, just speaking that way to look at, is this something we want to try? And again, having a change leader, someone who can really articulate the reasons why and compel people to at least give this a try is not easy at all.
that may be the biggest understatement on this episode. So, Mike, Janelle just talked about, right, how realistic is this? So if you were having to roll this out, right, where do you think you would see your biggest impediments to getting someone to take up this idea? And then how would you sell it? How would you coach it?
Yeah, the biggest impediments, I think, are going to be two things that will be roughly equivalent as far as the breadth of the impediment. One is the resistance, the human dynamic that Janelle just mentioned, and the other is the technical architecture, the code itself. How stable is it? How much risk is there? How risk averse or risk prone? What kind of appetite for risk does the company have? So I think those would be the impediments. I would try to, like most things, kind of be agile about my agile. I'd look for a proof, I agree with Janelle's perspective, stating the hypothesis, the benefit, what are we going to get out of this? Why is this even worth considering? And I hone in on the what's in it for me for the different people. Just make it real clear. Yeah, this is worth a shot because this is what it's going to do for you. And I find a proof case that was important enough, big enough, and had enough meat to it to prove that this could possibly work, but not so big and so central that it creates undue risk to the change or to the business. And then based off what we learned from that, then I would look for systematic, kind of gradual ways to spread this idea throughout the organization, and couple that with the inevitable change that is happening. So as things are being updated or rewritten or modified, or organizations are changing, people come and going, projects are winding down, new things are spinning up, whatever. And then the other thing I do is I would integrate this as a operating principle for new things going forward. So doing all that kind of in conjunction, then I've got the hypothesis, I've proven that it's possible, and then looked for incremental ways to spread it out. I would not try to do this all at once.
I'm still can't wrap my head around your whole idea about being agile and do agile. You can't do agile without a project plan. Come on, Mike. So there's another thing that comes up early on when they start talking about the inverse Conway. They start talking about Dunbar numbers. We don't need to go into that now, but I am going to, in the show notes, link to an excellent episode of the Jim Rutt show where he actually interviews Robin Dunbar, and they go in on all the different numbers and how they work. And they also tie to cognition and how much can humans maintain, how many connections can humans simultaneously maintain. On average, some of you may be able to have 350 direct connections in your largest circle, but on average, we average around 120 to 150. I will link to that in the show notes because I think it's a brilliant conversation. One of the things that did come up, which I forgot it came up until Mike, you mentioned it in the chat group, Mark Burgess's promise theory, which I thought was really wild to float that in. And Mike, if you could, can we talk a little bit about how that came up and how the authors talk about using promise theory when it comes to team interactions?
Sure. So I kind of feel like I need Ben here to really give promise theory the props. So I'll do my best to explain it. It's still kind of a hoo-ha, airy-fairy thing to me in some ways, but I also get it. So promise theory to me really is saying we're going to interact based on trust. I promise, I make a promise, I represent that I'll behave in a certain way, and you promise to represent that you'll consume my behavior and behave back to me in a certain way. That's kind of how it sinks into me. I don't know. I probably didn't get it completely.
No, I think you got it. What I remember, and I also put in the show notes a link to the interview we did with Mark Burgess. It comes around with when you trust someone, you state that I am going to deliver X. I'm going to make a promise to Nicholas that my API is going to do X. And if you're always talking in terms of promises and what you commit to deliver, it takes the mud out of the conversational water because it's a clear statement of I'm going to do this for you.
Yeah. So how it comes into play in the organization of teams in this book is that when it was in the context that, at least for me, of the team that's kind of like looking after an API, so to speak. So maybe either a platform team or a complicated subsystem team, and the way that the rest of the organization can interact with that code or that capability, based off promise theory, that I can trust the APIs and that they're reliable and that they're easy enough to use, and that any change in behavior that affects me will be well socialized and it won't catch me by surprise. And that's, at the end of the day, that to me, that's netting down to trust and communication, which kind of are important in most human endeavors.
Perfect. I think you summed it up well. I want to hop over to you, Nicholas, because I want to talk about like the meat of the book, right? So the meat of the book is the 4 different types of team topologies. So the first one is a stream-aligned team. And Nicholas, how would you describe that to someone who hadn't read the book?
So the streamlined team is like the the feature team or the product team that has some customer-facing functionality that they are providing in like very rapidly close collaboration. Like what usually when you think about an agile team, you think about the stream-aligned team.
Okay, and along the back of that, Nicholas, how would you? There's another concept of a complicated subsystem team. How would you sum that one up?
So sometimes you have, and these are like rarer cases. Like very few teams most of the teams would be the streamlined teams. But then sometimes you have some, and you don't necessarily have them even, but you can have something that requires some specialized knowledge that you need to have some people like focusing on some like, I don't know, like Google search algorithms or something like that. And or maybe something like more exotic, I don't know, COBOL programming or something like that most people don't know and don't want to know. So that would typically be like the complicated subsystem team. And then like but they are serving the streamlined teams because they're like their customers are the streamlined teams.
Perfect. So Mike, I'm going to ask you to define one that I know you and I outside of this show have had multiple conversations around their positives and negatives, the platform team. Can you explain the platform team?
Sure. So the platform team is looking after what commonly might be called a platform, which is a set of functions or functionality that are used then to create and enable things that are exposed to a customer. So a platform team could be internal within a company. So the book uses a really relatable example. Your infrastructure as a service, that's a platform team. So current client I'm working with, they're in the on-prem to cloud migration. They're building a menu of services that I need this much compute, I need this much storage, and other aspects. So they're like a platform team. They're building a capability that's then used internally. A platform could also be external, customer facing, but you're selling a platform. So it's less directly connected to something a customer sees and cares about, but it's the foundational component that then is used to create something a customer cares about.
Perfect. And last one, Mike, I'm going to ask you to define what is an enabling team.
This one got a little bit squishy for me. As far as the difference between that and a platform team, but an enabling team, as I understood it, there's a team that creates capabilities that then others can use. And then where it got a little squishy is when they were talking about the different interaction patterns and the facilitating interaction pattern.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it. So one of the first questions I want to talk about, or a question I'm going to start with you, Nicholas, because you actually posed this in the chat group. You said with these types of teams and even these interaction models, like how these teams work with each other, are we just putting a name on what happens in real life? Or is this really truly a pattern that we can emphasize to increase the quality of our interactions amongst teams? What are your thoughts?
So you're referring now to the 3 like interaction models between the teams?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I do think they make sense. So the 3 ones they defined, they were like X as a service. So meaning that you provide your platform, maybe your complicated subsystem as a service that the other teams consume. And then we had the facilitating one where like you try to remove those impediments there. And then was the collaboration was the last of those modes there. I think like the benefit here is that they are like, what the authors kind of are saying here is that as a team, you do one of these at a time. And that like is a if it works, it's quite powerful, because then you don't need to kind of again try to go to too many directions at the same time. So to me, it makes sense.
My question, and I guess I'll yes and that, Nicholas, the idea of facilitation versus collaboration versus X as a service, doesn't this whole agile thing talk about collaboration being first and foremost? So how does isn't everything a collaborative conversation at the end of the day?
Yeah, okay. And I think like every team needs some level of collaboration. Like if you're a platform team, you provide a service to other teams, you need to have some discussions every now and then with them to understand what are their future needs and all that. But the primary mechanism is not that you are sitting together in a room and having like those day-to-day collaborations, which is like what they meant by collaboration pattern as I understood it.
Okay.
So I it kind of boils down to how do you exactly understand those patterns.
Right. I do think the idea of rules of engagement, for lack of a better term, how does a platform team talk to a complicated subcomponent team, right? Those, at least defining them and having that construct out there, even if you follow it or not, I think is beneficial, because it, rising tide, all ships and all that sort of stuff. So Mike, I'm going to bounce to you because there was an interesting quote early on in the book that I know some of us bandied back and forth. And the quote was, "Not all communication and collaboration is good." So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, have you actually seen bad communication and collaboration? And how valid is this statement in your experience?
Yeah, I've seen bad communication for sure. Like communication that just doesn't work. People are not getting shared understanding. But I've seen, I don't know if I would call it bad, but maybe low value communication and low value collaboration. So have it expecting like let me use a real world example to illustrate this point. Otherwise, I'll just stumble over it. Worked with a group of 4 different agile release trains. So this is in a safe context, and there was a mistaken belief that everybody from every art in that group had to participate in every system demo from everyone. So you had 500 people collaborating, seeing the system demo at the end of the PI to quote give feedback, and 99.8% of those people didn't really care, and they weren't gonna have anything meaningful to say. So that was an attempt at collaboration and communication that was wasteful and really kind of destructive. Bit of an extreme example, real world example, but that's taking the idea and applying it absolutely. Kind of like going to the buffet and it's like, chocolate's good, so I'm going to eat 27 chocolate cakes.
Right. Yeah. Too much of a good thing is not still a good thing. It doesn't scale in that regard.
Yeah. So like most things, context and applying the principle and the idea in a way that you get the intended benefit, not just doing the action. And the other thing precisely. The other thing along the same lines is that these communication patterns, I think of them similar to service level expectations. So this is how we expect to interact, but yes, things may vary. So it's not, what I would be really sad to see happen is these communication pattern identified, and then people say, well, I can't talk to you because it's outside this pattern. I'm sorry, Nicholas, you were going to say something? I
was just adding that I think you were precisely getting with your example to the point the authors made there in the book, that you can kind of like do like nice things, but they are maybe not so valuable, like participating in every demo. So that's why I think it's kind of valuable, something what's actually essential, and they have like a kind of like a pattern that you can apply and reduce it to just very limited things. So I think that was the key point there.
Very true. One of the concepts in this book that we didn't touch on, but I do want to loop back on because I do think it's important. The idea of fracture planes. So one of the concepts in this book is they talk about we deal with multiple monoliths. So application monoliths, monolithic builds, monolithic releases, monolithic architecture, monolithic thinking. Right. I thought that was really kind of fascinating. And then from there, the book goes into fracture planes, which is the idea of where do I draw my lines of demarcation? Where do I draw my bounded context? And they talk about things like business domain, regulatory compliance, change cadence, even things like risk or performance isolation. What did you think in this section, Nicholas? Because this one really resonated for me. I really kind of thought that was eye-opening. Not just looking at code and ownership, but
yeah.
You know, where does the thing where is it going to break down in the larger context? What were your thoughts?
I don't usually like work with those type of questions, like breaking down monoliths. So it was interesting for me, but maybe I didn't get like those profound insights from it personally. So it's I'm happy to hand this over to Mike.
Lucky guy. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah. That chapter on fracture planes made a lot of sense to me because it's kind of like a menu of choices for how to best think about evolving towards more modular, because the architecture of the code is one of the biggest inhibitors to flow in many of these cases. So I took it. I thought they were very insightful ideas, and you know, the nuances and specifics of any monolith and the environment it's in are probably going to drive that. I really found myself attracted to the idea of the change cadence being a key one, because if you align on change cadence, that can help improve flow, because you're batching changes in similar ways. So if you need, you're doing changes that on an infrequent cadence, you're going to have larger changes and you're going to have higher cost of regression testing, so you can get some efficiency from regression testing, a whole bunch of stuff, as long as you don't do too much, because then you don't know what you broke. And
right.
Smaller or more frequent changes would tend to be smaller, and that seems like a natural clustering. So that one really resonated for me. The other one that I kind of stood out was change based on the persona or user type or user, the job to be done with the software. So like, most of us have worked with an application that has an administrative portion. So that tends to fall out on itself easily. But high volume users versus low volume users is another way to think about it. Your high volume users are also going to be your higher risk users. So that all made a lot of sense. And I thought, that's a great menu to stimulate thought.
Multimodal options, as opposed to saying it has to be done this way. It's really, here's something you might want to think about. Do we want to think about this, or do we think about this? You could almost do one of those weird sort of like personality test games where this resonates more than this. True, or to me, this resonates more than this. So there's a business opportunity there.
Like the eye doctor exam.
All right. Well, we're quickly approaching time. So unfortunately for our listeners, we're not ignoring Janelle. Janelle unfortunately had to step out. So I want to go around the horn for some final thoughts. Would you recommend this book? What are your final thoughts? What are some of the biggest things you get out of it? What would you tell someone else if they were saying, I'm debating picking up this book? What do you think? I'm going to start with you, Nicholas.
Sure. Well, I would say it like this, that if you work in an organization or like with a client, do you think there's room to improve the flow within the organization? Because there are like too many dependencies, and or there's too much context switching, or there is like too much cognitive overload. In that case, I very strongly recommend this book. I think it's like they have a very credible solution, very well researched, like and thorough kind of approach to how to think about those type of problems. and just through organizational design or redesign. So
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Mike, final thoughts?
Yes, I think it's a book that's definitely worth the read, even if you're not breaking up a monolith or designing an organization. There's ideas and perspectives and wisdom embedded in little bits and pieces in this book that can be useful regardless. So for instance, a group I'm working with currently, it's one team, maybe going to be two teams. There's no real major design decisions about the structure, but I've recommended it to their leadership, sit and ask them to keep this in mind so that you design your people structure and your application for the future. So there's a lot of wisdom to be had in there. And there's one quote in there that just really stuck out to me, and that was, disbanding high-performing teams is worse than vandalism. It's corporate psychopathy.
That was Alan Kelly. Yes. Shout out to Alan. Yeah.
If you can get that takeaway from this book, then you're doing good.
Fantastic. No, there's no better way to end it. So once again, I want to thank Janelle, Nicholas, and Mike for joining us. On behalf of Janelle, Nicholas, Mike, and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, a rating, some feedback on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, Amazon Podcasts, your platform of choice. It does help others find us. If you'd like to join the discussion, we have a very vibrant Discord community, which is where everybody comes out of. So if you're interested, please find us on Discord. There will be a link in the show notes. Please hop in, join the conversation, tell us what you think. Lastly, the Agile Uprising is committed to always be free. However, if you like what you heard and do want to contribute, we do have a Patreon out there, which helps offset some of our hosting, production, security costs. We have been DDoSed so many times. It's kind of joking. See the show notes for details. If you really want to contribute, we do appreciate it. No need to, but it is kind of nice. You might get a surprise in the mail. It might be a whole bunch of stickers from me. Who knows? So once again, I want to thank Nicholas, Mike, and Janelle. Until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.